Thank you so much. It's really an honor and pleasure to be here today. I'm really flattered to be invited by such a prestigious organization, and certainly I want to express my appreciation for the kind treatment and hospitality that I've received so far since I've been here. Um, I'm going to tell you, this is Black History Month. I love to talk about technology and the work that I'm doing. But, since it's Black History Month, I thought I'd do a little bit of history also and kind of tie it into my story, and hopefully you'll identify with some of my experiences. At least I know some of you will. But I am an engineer, and we are a special group thinking about history. You may recall the story of, some of you may know of the story of where there was a doctor, a lawyer, and an engineer back in medieval time that were scheduled to be executed by guillotine. They were all sitting on the execution stand, waiting their turn. The executioner was there with his hood on. Of course, the priest was there to pray their souls to heaven. And so they started the process. It was first the doctor got up, they put his head in the guillotine, they pulled the lever, and it came down about this close, and it got stuck. And the priest says, "Praise the Lord, it's divine intervention. You have to let him go free." And so they opened the guillotine and let him go. And next it was the lawyer. They put his head in and pulled the lever. The same thing happened. Just before his neck, it went, got stuck. Divine intervention, the priest said again, and of course the lawyer says, "Equal treatment under the law. You have to let me go." And so of course they opened it up and let him go. And then the engineer's turn came, and they looked at him. He jumped up and said, "Wait! I think I know how to fix this thing." So we'll see if we can't fix this thing. I started out as a small child, back in the 50s. I played in my neighborhood in the street in front of my house along with the other neighborhood kids. And peculiar thing though, we would play stickball and foursquare, but every time we'd see a police car in our neighborhood, we would all run and hide. Instinctively, we did this. We would run and hide. We hid under houses, behind trees, and we'd be very quiet. And it was just the way we were back at the time. I never really questioned why, I understood why, but this was in Mobile, Alabama, back in the 50s. I never really questioned it. It would just seem like the normal thing for us to do. A few years ago, I met a journalist named Douglas Blackman. He was with the Wall Street Journal, and he had written a book called Slavery by Another Name. I want to share you a few instances that are documented in that book. In July 31st, 1903, the White House received a letter to President Theodore Roosevelt from a lady named Carrie Kinsley, barely literate African-American woman from Bainbridge, Georgia. Her 14-year-old brother, James Robinson, had been abducted and sold to a plantation. Local police knew nothing about it. They showed no interest. "Mr. President," wrote Ms. Kinsley, struggling to overcome the illiteracy of her world, "they won't let me have him. He has done nothing for them to have him in chains, so I write to you for help." Like the vast majority of such pleas during that time, her letter was slipped into a rectangular envelope at the Department of Justice and tagged with a reference number. In this case, it was 12007. No other action was recorded. Her letter right now is in the National Archives. On March 30th, 1908, Green Cottingham, who was a 22-year-old African-American man, was arrested by the sheriff in Shelby County, Alabama, and charged with vagrancy, which basically meant that he couldn't prove that he had a job. He was found guilty and was given 1 year of hard labor. He was turned over to the U.S. Steel Corporation for $12 a month, and within hours, he was plunged within a mine called Slope Number 12 of the Pratt Mines near Birmingham, Alabama. He was chained to a wooden barrack at night and forced to dig almost every waking hour, and was subject to the whip if he didn't make his quota. He, along with 6 of his fellow miners died under harsh treatment that year. They, along with hundreds of others, are buried in shallow graves among the refuse from the mine. Judges and sheriffs who sold convicts to giant corporations and prison mines also leased larger numbers of African Americans to local farmers. They allowed their neighbors and political supporters to acquire still more black laborers directly from the courtrooms. Millions of blacks lived in terror. Revenues from neo-slavery poured the equivalent of millions of dollars into treasuries of Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana, Georgia, Florida, Texas, North Carolina, and South Carolina, where 75% of the black population lived. Fast forward to October 31st, 1941. Charles Bedloe pleaded guilty in federal court, Mobile, Alabama, my hometown, to a charge of peonage for holding a black man named Martin Thompson against his will. Using the same techniques that had been used by others dating back to 1903, he didn't feel like the courts would deal with him harshly. And sure enough, federal officials and the district court judge only fined him $100. Black neo-slavery was firmly entrenched. 2 months later, the imperial forces of Japan attacked Pearl Harbor. In August 1942, 7 months into the war, American leaders were anxious to mobilize every possible soldier and to counter every thrust of Japan's and Germany's propaganda machine. Japan was urging that the place for the Negro in the war was alongside the yellow man. The U.S. was finding it difficult to establish a moral platform from which to criticize Germany for its treatment of Jews. Suddenly, cases of lynching and involuntary servitude were being vigorously investigated. With the dawn of World War II, profound global forces began to touch the lives of Black Americans. By the late 1950s, reports of investigations of involuntary servitude had reduced to a trickle. However, the social impact had already been ingrained. Out of a desire to protect their loved ones, many parents taught their small, innocent children playing in neighborhood streets, in Mobile in particular, to use run and hide tactics to stay clear of the police. Actually, those tactics paid off for me. One evening, I was riding my bicycle to my grandmother's house. It was not a policeman that got behind me, but it was a car, and it was a new bicycle I had gotten for Christmas, and I was all excited about it. And I saw this car turn the corner coming behind me down the street, and I was thinking, geez, my bicycle was very fast. I was pedaling fast, pretending I could outrun the car. And sure enough, as I turned, the car turned, and I turned again, the car turned, I realized that he really was behind me. Before I could get to the next corner, he was approaching me. I ran off the road. He went down to the corner, turned around, and started heading back toward me, and I started heading back toward my mother's house. Got within about a half a block, and they were upon me again. I ran off the road, ran up the hill into some bushes, and I was hiding amongst some thorns. They stopped the car, got out, was looking for me, and they were pointing up the hill, thinking that I had gotten away and gone up the hill, and they were looking around, and I could hear them talking about, wondering, where I was. Now, it turned out I was a lot closer than they thought I was, but I was in these thorns, my legs were burning, but I dared not move. I shudder to think what would have happened to me if they had gotten hold of me that evening. But they eventually gave up and got in the car and left. Of course, I stayed there a while longer to make sure they were gone. After World War II, African Americans returned home as fighting men, unwilling to capitulate to the docile state of helplessness that had existed prior to the war. Many of them joined the agitation that eventually became the Civil Rights Movement. In 1957, Martin Luther King assumed leadership of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. In 1958, he met with President Eisenhower, in the Oval Office. With the dawn of the 60s, the Civil Rights Movement was in full swing. This was the time when I was coming of age. As a small child, I was a tinkerer, and I liked to figure out how things worked. I was always curious about math and science. I was 12 years old when I watched TV and President Kennedy made his moon speech. Talked about his vision of sending a man to the moon. I was intrigued and I hung on every word. His statements had a profound impact on my life. He said, I realize that in some measure, this is an act of vision, for we know not now what benefits await us. But if I were to say to you today, my fellow citizens, that we shall send a man to the moon 240,000 miles away from a control station in Houston, a giant rocket 300 feet tall, length of a football field, made of new metal alloys, some of which have not yet been invented, capable of withstanding heat and stresses several times more than those that have ever been experienced. Fitted together finer than the precision of a finest watch, carrying all of the equipment needed for guidance, control, communications, food, and survival on an untried mission to an unknown celestial body, and then return it safely to Earth, re-entering the atmosphere at speeds over 25,000 miles an hour, causing heat about half the temperatures of the sun, almost as hot as it is here today, he said to his speech. And do all of this and do it right, and do it first before this decade is out. Then we must be bold. His vision of sending a man to the moon before the decade was out, using materials and inventions that had not been invented yet, had a profound impact on me. We were in the race to the moon. It was in the 60s. The Vietnam had escalated, and the civil rights movement was in full swing. When I think about that era, I can't help but wonder how many of you really are in touch with the significance of Dr. King's impact. Black people were rioting and marching. There were massive lootings, and American cities were burning. Some cities reported as many as 1,000 fires. The military was in Vietnam. The National Guards were in the streets here at home. In 1963, Governor George Wallace stood in the door of the University of Alabama to prevent William Malone and James Hood, two Black students, from entering. President Kennedy federalized the Alabama National Guard and sent 100 guardsmen to escort the students to the university so they could register. That year, November 22nd, 1963, President John Kennedy was assassinated in Dallas. In 1964, Dr. King won the Nobel Prize. In June 1968, Senator Robert Kennedy, the brother of President Kennedy, was assassinated in Los Angeles after winning the California Democratic primary for president. Within Black communities, Black militants were being hailed as heroes, and many were expounding revolution. Both white people and Black people were being killed. Every time I hear about a suicide bombing or some other catastrophic event in the Middle East, I can't help but wonder if it had not been for Dr. Martin Luther King, could America have plunged into a similar devastating long-term struggle? Martin encouraged and actively sought harmony and fair treatment. He encouraged African Americans to hold their heads high and walk with dignity. At the same time, he provided white Americans with the opportunity to see themselves and their actions more clearly. In April 1968, Dr. Martin Luther King was assassinated, the year that I graduated high school. By this time, Martin's dream had taken hold. America was forever changed. I was inspired. That same year, my science project, Linux Robot, won first place in a Junior Engineering and Technical Society Regional Conference held at the University of Alabama, the same campus where Governor Wallace had stood in the door and pledged that no Black students would ever attend. Now, they didn't offer me a scholarship or try to recruit me. Neil Armstrong stepped on the moon on July 21st, 1969. President Kennedy's vision for space exploration was achieved. The great ideas in the 60s spawned a period of social enlightenment. Technological advancements that we enjoy today have their roots in President Kennedy's initiative. Most important of that is our attitude toward aggressively pushing science, not just exploring science out of curiosity, but we have visions now and we have things that we want to achieve, and we push science to achieve those goals. Dr. King's vision of social enlightenment has resulted in interracial tolerance and cooperation and compassion at levels that are unprecedented in American history. We now have America's first African-American president, something that I thought would never happen in my lifetime. Under his leadership, we faced down the largest recession since the Great Depression, and we're now moving toward an economy that will be driven by energy technology. And I was just reminded even about President Obama's initiative on cancer, where he's going to try and really devote a lot of resources toward curing cancer. But energy technology, why energy? Energy consumption is directly related to prosperity and quality of life. Back in 2002, 2003 timeframe, the Nobel Prize laureate Richard Smalley did a study to try to identify the top 10 problems facing humanity. And they're on this list in priority. Energy was number one, and he rationalized energy being number one based on the fact that if you could solve the energy problem, you have the wherewithal to solve all of the problems on the list. Petroleum has been a focus of national strategies for prosperity and also a source of agitation and war. There are about 1.2 billion cars in the world. It's projected to be about 2 billion by 1935. The challenge that we face is that we must find a way or engineer a way or have a vision to achieve prosperity throughout the world, particularly within developing countries, without creating a world of bickering over dwindling resources. As history has taught us, when you leave a people out, when you relegate them to a desperate state of having nothing to lose, they can become very dangerous. Technology advancements have a phenomenal impact on human existence. A large percentage of the world population has not yet experienced many of the modern conveniences that we routinely take for granted. Other nations are now moving aggressively to improve the quality of life of their population. As they make progress, their needs for energy will continue to grow as well, and as they use more energy, they will have impacts on the environment. This is an interesting chart here. The yellow or gold area here represents the period where we basically use biofuels. We burn trees or biomass as a source of energy. Around the 1850 time frame, you can see this trend start to change. The gray area represents coal. I can't use a pointer. All right. Well, the gray area is coal. The magenta is oil, and the pale green is actually natural gas. And so you can see we started to use fossil fuels. We'll try this pointer again. Okay. It did.
I think you could use the mouse. You can use the cursor.
Well, this is not
Or
very.
you could just use your finger.
Ah. Okay, let me try this. In any case, if you look in the 1850 time frame, this trend started to increase. We started our dependence on fossil fuels. If you look here at this chart, around 1850, which is in here, you can see the increased trend here toward higher levels of CO2 in the atmosphere. You can also look here, this is from fossil records showing the average temperature of the Earth, and you can see also a trend here in recent years since the 1800s where that trend started to increase. This is very compelling. For those of you who may feel like, well, it's not man-made, it's not really fossil fuels, then I think we should get the fossil fuels off the table because we're facing a dramatic change here. we need to do something. Um, our national security depends on a healthy environment and a content and prosperous world. Um, Rapid deployment of sustainable energy technology should be a national priority. Bill Gates is on record saying that we need to do within a few years what might normally take over 100 years in order to avoid the calamity that we're about to face in our environment. When he made that statement, this image came to mind. This is the flagship, the Santa Maria, Columbus's flagship. It traveled the ocean. It took about 70 days to come to America back in 1492, traveling at a speed of about 2.5 miles an hour. This picture, by the way, is scaled, so you're actually looking at the size of the ship relative to the size of the Saturn rocket. The Saturn rocket, of course, was moving at 250, almost 250, 238,000 miles an hour, whereas the Santa Maria was moving at about 2.5 miles an hour. Now, keep in mind, just as people now today, a lot of people still argue whether or not global warming is real. Back then, as those guys were traveling across the ocean, I can't help but wonder what it was like on that ship, because I'm sure a lot of them still were wondering if the world was really flat. And if they woke up the next morning, if they were going to be falling off the earth, if they were going to survive this voyage. It took a lot of courage. But this is a dramatic indication. It took about 500 years of advancement in technology to move from fabric and sticks to a missile that could go to the moon. It took a lot of vision as well. But to do that kind of dramatic change, advance in a very short period of time, is a very daunting challenge. This is my first patent. It basically is using optical sensors to read the digitally encoded information that's been photographically reduced onto a binary scale. It's the base technology for CDs and DVDs. I got that patent back in 1979 before anybody had thought about CDs and DVDs. But I was having fun. I was working on out-of-planetary spacecraft. I had done orbit insertion analysis for the shuttle on the Voyager mission. I worked on the Galileo mission, left the Air Force, actually went to work at Jet Propulsion Laboratory. I actually have an invention on the Galileo spacecraft, one that I feel very good about, because my fellow engineers, my peers, some of the best engineers from across the country said, "Johnson, that'll never work." But I was convinced that it would. We solved a major problem. I was actually a fault protection engineer on the Cassini mission, which recently was in the news because of its success at Saturn. I've done nuclear analysis for gas-cooled, high-temperature nuclear reactors. I actually worked on stealth bomber back when the military was not even acknowledging that it existed. It was a very highly classified project. And as was mentioned earlier, I invented a toy water gun too. That water gun actually generated over $1 billion in retail sales, but I'm also responsible for to a large extent for the Nerf dart gun, I'm sorry. It generates averages about $4 billion a year in retail sales. I wish I had more of that, some of that. But in any case, right now what I'm doing is, this is me showing me with some of the toys that I developed. This dart gun that is there in the forefront was actually an automatic machine gun. I'm now developing advanced battery technology. I'm developing two types of batteries. The upcoming generation, which is an all-solid-state ceramic battery that uses a glass as an electrolyte instead of a liquid. I started on this technology a long time ago. Back in the late 90s, actually, I got a license from Oak Ridge National Laboratory. Oak Ridge had developed this electrolyte called Lipon, which was a glass, and they were making solid-state micro batteries. But you could only make micro batteries with that technology, and I wanted to be able to make larger scale batteries. So I embarked on a program to use more conventional ceramic processing techniques to make all solid state batteries using conventional processing like green tape casting, firing in ovens, curing, and the whole 9 yards. And we now have batteries working. It's been quite an effort, but we are now realizing the success, and it's been like pulling teeth, literally. And we had a lot of false starts along the way, not one single breakthrough, but a lot of little incremental improvements. I'm also developing a new type of engine. This is an all-solid-state engine. It's a ceramic device. It's amenable to 3D printing techniques where you can literally put together layers of ceramic materials, fire it in an oven, you take that out, bond it to the polymer section, and it will convert heat directly into electricity with no moving mechanical parts. I was describing it this morning, talking about how the fact that it operates on a Carnot equivalent cycle, the Ericsson thermodynamic cycle. The last engine that was invented that operated on a Carnot equivalent cycle was the Stirling engine that was invented about 200 years ago. And befitting of the state of the technology today, i.e. 3D printing, this is an all solid state 3D printable conversion technology that offers extremely high efficiency. In fact, because it can operate at temperatures, because of its ceramic structure, it can operate on heat source temperatures significantly higher than you can operate with the Stirling. It will exceed the performance of the Stirling engine. I've invested all of my resources into this technology and the work that I'm doing. And my one hope is that my achievements and the contributions that I make are worthy of the sacrifices that so many people have made that make it possible for me to do what I do. Thank you.